Write history, the White House published a new webpage on January 6th, calling the people who charged the Capitol and assaulted Capitol Police, quote, unfairly targeted, overcharged, and used as political examples, end quote. Hello and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. What really happened 5 years ago on January 6, 2021? Is this revisionist history, or are there two legitimate sides to this story? For more on this, I'm now joined by USA Today White House correspondent Bart Jansen and national correspondent Sarah Wire. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Bart, let's set the scene. What led up to the events here on January 6th, 2021?
Well, Trump lost the 2020 election. And after that loss, he continued to argue that voting irregularities cost him the election unfairly in a half dozen toss-up states that he considered competitive, and that he basically has argued since then that he won. He did not, but his lawyers fielded 60 lawsuits to try to challenge the results. They lost in all but one of them. His campaign lawyers, such as Rudy Giuliani, never produced evidence of widespread voter fraud. And so the election results were upheld and Joe Biden became president. But before the inauguration on January 20th, Trump organized a rally at the Ellipse near the White House to give a speech on January 6th when the Electoral College votes were going to be counted in Congress. He sent out an invitation on social media on December 19th, 2020, saying, "We'll be wild." And thousands of people showed up. They listened to his speech. He, early in the speech, encouraged protesters to behave peacefully and patriotically. But later in the speech, as he ramped up, he said that they should fight for the future of the country, that if they don't fight, that they will lose their country, in encouraging the protesters to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue to protest at the Capitol. At the Capitol, thousands of people swarmed and many entered the building in hand-to-hand fighting that left 140 police officers injured. So his encouragement has been criticized as inciting the riot that took place on January 6th.
Sarah, you were one of the very few reporters who were in the actual chamber where the transfer of power was to happen with the counting of the electoral votes. Normally, some would say a very boring process. What did you see?
It is normally a very boring process. It's the kind of thing you send the intern to. But we knew it was going to be contested that day. And so we were just kind of waiting to see what had happened. It felt pretty routine and normal until there was a alert that went out warning everyone to shelter in place. And then short time later, there was the House Sergeant at Arms walked out onto the floor and interrupted the proceedings, something that never happens, and explained that protesters had gotten into the rotunda and started handing out gas masks to members of Congress. And the whole atmosphere in the room just changed. Suddenly, members of Congress were screaming at each other. One member got on to a desk and started explaining how to put the gas masks on. They proceeded to evacuate the members of Congress. But there were still a lot of us up in the upper galleries. It was the middle of COVID. And so many members of Congress were up on the upper level. And, I'll never forget the sound of those doors locking at the upper level. They're 8-foot doors. And hearing those slam shut, boom, 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 boom. Kind of a little known fact that Capitol Police, their job is to protect the continuity of government. So if there's a natural disaster or an attack on the Capitol, their job is to make sure that as many members of Congress survive as possible so the government can still function. And members of Congress started yelling over the balcony, "What about us? What about us?" And you could just see, we were on our own. And you could begin hearing the protesters and the rioters banging on the door to the chamber that the president walks in for the State of the Union. And they broke through the glass, and police, pushed a big chest in front of the doors, and they were arguing back and forth, and suddenly guns were drawn. And, they told the members of the press and the members of Congress to get down on their bellies and go over to one side of the chamber. And that's when we heard the gunshot that killed one of the protesters, Ashley Babbitt, who was trying to climb into the House chamber. And smoke started to rise up through the doors to the chamber because they had deployed tear gas to clear the crowd. And it became so silent. All I could hear was members of Congress praying and the whine of the filtration hoods.
Sarah, I understand that you were one of only 3 reporters who were in the House safe room. What was that like?
Tension was very high. There was a member of Congress got up quickly and begged the other people in the room to not give any interviews to the few members of the press who were there because we might give away their location. And I remember just thinking to myself, lady, I'm in here too. There was an argument quickly between elderly members of Congress and some of the newer members who were laughing and joking, watching it on their phones. And the elderly members, trying to explain how serious this was and asking them to put their COVID masks back on for the safety of everyone. After 4 or 5 hours in the safe room, the speaker, Nancy Pelosi, came back in and explained that Congress would be reconvening, they would continue. But it had taken that long for the police to get control of the Capitol building back.
Bart, following the events of January 6th, Democrats who controlled the House at that time convened a select committee to investigate the events of January 6th. This was a made-for-TV event with weeks of testimony, some dramatic testimony from some of the 140 police officers who were injured that day. What did you hear from them, Bart?
Yeah, they held a special session of testimony from 4 officers in particular, 2 from the Capitol Police Force and 2 from the D.C. Metropolitan Force, who came in as reinforcements that day. One of the D.C. officers, Michael Fanone, called it nothing short of brutal. He had been dragged down the steps. He suffered a heart attack, was severely injured in the attack. Another DC officer, Daniel Hodges, was crushed in a door, the incident being captured on video, and they nearly squeezed the life out of him as between the surging forces back and forth during one of the lower level doors into the Capitol building. But on another day, some more dramatic testimony came from Capitol Police Officer Caroline Edwards, who served next to Officer Brian Sicknick. Sicknick is the officer who died the day after the riot. His death was ruled from natural causes, but he had been sprayed with chemical sprays during the attack, and other police officers and his relatives said he wouldn't have died if not for the riot. Edwards said that the fighting down on the steps outside the Capitol was medieval, and that as officers slipped on blood and vomit, that they were falling to the ground and getting trampled by protesters. So it was quite a harrowing experience for the police.
Bart, staying on the issue of the assaults that happened, Trump, as promised on the campaign trail, issued a blanket pardon for hundreds of rioters who were responsible for injuring those officers, as well as damaging the Capitol. How did police respond?
Well, particularly the participants who had protected the Capitol during the riot said that they felt betrayed, that it sounded like the history of the event was being rewritten and, in fact, the violence being ignored. Capitol Police Sergeant Aquilino Ganell, who was one of those 4 officers that testified in the initial House hearings, said that he felt like that they'd been forgotten, that they were trying to erase what he did. He was also told that he was warned that people that he had testified against in court were being released from prison, for him to be mindful of that. So again, a resuming threat years after the incident. And so he argued that he's, lost his career, his health. He remains injured with harm to his shoulder and foot that he still feels to this day.
Testimony from Jack Smith, the federal prosecutor who brought charges against then former President Trump, subsequently dropped, was released last week. Bart, what did we learn from that?
Well, Smith was, yes, a special counsel to investigate Trump on a variety of matters. One of them led to an indictment for basically inciting the January 6th riot. And Smith continued to say that Trump was the most culpable and the most responsible for the events that happened that day. But he was a special employee of the Justice Department. The Justice Department had longstanding policy that it could not prosecute a sitting president of the United States. So after Trump won the 2024 election, under that policy, Smith dropped the charges, and that ended the federal case against Trump. But during his testimony to the House committee, Smith said that he continued to believe that the riot does not happen without Trump, and that he could have proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump participated in a criminal conspiracy.
Both Republicans and Democrats marked the fifth anniversary of the January 6th riot. How so, Sarah?
Democrats held a hearing where they brought in several people to testify about what happened that day, what they personally experienced. And one of the most powerful pieces of testimony was one of the rioters who has declined Trump's pardon. That she's now learned more about what happened, the causes of it, and wants to accept and acknowledge her role in it. She apologized to police officers and said that she's going to continue trying to bring attention to this in the years ahead, especially until a plaque that was approved by Congress honoring the police who fought that day is hung in the building as it was required to be under law. For years now, it's sat in a closet or in a room somewhere in the Capitol building and hasn't been hung. President Donald Trump spoke about it at a meeting with Republicans, and he really tried to cast the blame for what happened on to the rioters, onto the press for how they covered it, onto the House committee that investigated what happened. And we heard a lot from House Republicans acknowledging the violence, but not placing the blame on anyone in particular. There was also a march up to the Capitol by several of the now pardoned rioters. They got permit for about 250 people, and reports show that about 100 people showed up, and they marched the same route that they took 5 years ago from the Ellipse to the Capitol. There was some arguing with police officers, but it remained pretty peaceful, and they said they were there to remember the people who died.
Bart, on the January 6th anniversary, the Republicans also announced that they're convening their own committee to investigate the events of that day in 2021. What are their goals?
Yeah, they argue basically that the original committee was stacked by Democrats, that they didn't have enough of a voice, and so they are trying to give what they would argue is a rounder perspective on what happened. One of the major points that they want to raise was the basic lack of protection at the Capitol in case a large crowd got out of control. Trump has said repeatedly that he offered to provide 10,000 National Guard troops to protect the Capitol, that he thought that there was going to be a big crowd and that they should have more security. But the January 6th committee, the original one, looked into that claim and found that he did mention that to aides, but that he didn't wind up actually deploying them. His acting Secretary of Defense at the time said that there was no order to deploy the troops. And so it winds up being an argument about different perspectives on how far that offer went. This hearing on the anniversary allowed House Speaker at the time, Nancy Pelosi, to say that she didn't take blame for the lack of National Guard troops there. She noted that lawmakers spent 3 hours pleading with Trump to call off the protesters and to send in more National Guard to help protect the Capitol and protect security in the city. So it continues to be very contentious. And the House Republicans want to look basically more at how much security was requested, what happened, test those claims about whether pleas for help were ignored, that sort of thing. They want to get out more of their perspective about what happened on that day.
Phrase often attributed to Joseph Goebbels is, quote, repeat a lie often enough and it becomes the truth. Trump's version of history is now part of the official record as part of the White House's website. Will his efforts be successful at rewriting history? I'll start with you, Bart.
Well, I guess the question is, how much impact will these new statements make? I think that was part of the goal of the original House committee investigating the riot, to set a record, hundreds of pages report, many, many videos, well, thousands of videos and other documents to just chronicle what happened that day so that it would not be forgotten. But now Trump is in office, and so he carries a very big bullhorn himself in being able to say basically his argument that the police didn't act appropriately that day, that they sort of blew it, and that the riot got out of hand, and which of course offends the police officers a great deal. So I guess, we'll have to see how history gauges this rebuttal from the Trump administration. He's still got 3 more years to go. He can continue to broadcast these claims in rebuttal to the House Democratic report. And we'll have to see how much that resonates with the American public. My sense is that it's divided into, at least two camps, where people remember January 6th as they remember 9/11, and they say a horrible day, something that should never be repeated. And others among Trump supporters appreciate his rebutting that and siding with him to say everything got blown out of proportion, that it wasn't as bad as people say.
Sarah, you were there. What are your final thoughts here?
You know, we all heard the member of Congress who referred to this as a tourist visit. And there were tens of thousands of people there. There were some people there with the aim to commit violence. There were some people there who got swept up in the fur of the moment and walked in. But when I walked out of the safe room and back into the halls of Congress, I was slipping on, fire extinguisher residue and tear gas residue. And there was broken glass that took months to replace, and trash everywhere, and blood smeared on statues. One member of Congress told me that, sitting inside the House chamber, she was burning from the tear gas residue that was covering everything. This wasn't a simple walk to a Capitol building. And I know a lot of people were really surprised when everyone was pardoned, including the people who caused the most violence that day. It'll be fascinating to find out, kind of how history looks back on this moment, and which narrative wins out in the long run.
USA Today White House correspondent Bart Jansen and national correspondent Sarah Wire, thank you both so much for joining me on The Excerpt.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.